is a timber sale prep forester and is a certified silviculturist in Region 5. Ryan has also worked in the fire effects program for the National Park Service, performing forest growth and yield field research for the University of California, as well as was a forestry aide for the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. He holds a bachelor's in science and a master's in forestry from the University of California at Berkeley. And he says that his career has been framed by measuring, harvesting, burning, and planting trees, all of which give him immense satisfaction, as do backcountry skiing, gardening, cooking, and eating. It sounds like he has quite a busy life. I do want to point one thing out before I pass the mic over to him. So in this bottom left here, you're going to see this chat box. As we're moving forward with the presentation, if you have a question, just type it there. And at the end of the session, we'll do a question and answer session. And I'll take those questions that you've typed there and give them to Ryan at the end. And so with that, we're going to turn it over to Ryan for post-fire restoration considerations.
Hey, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Or can I get a yes in the chat box maybe? Thanks, guys. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I'm here with some folks in the room too, so you might hear a little background noise, but I'll be the one sort of shouting into the speaker. So as Stacy said, I've worked on the Plumas for about 13 years in vegetation management, much of it in silviculture, and unfortunately much of it working in post-fire landscapes. So I really need to preface this talk that, it's based on my experience as a Forest Service manager, so the themes that I'll be talking about will be focused on public land management and primarily, cedar mixed conifer forest, dry pine-dominated cedar mixed conifer forest. I would like to give a plug. The UC Extension had some reforestation webinars in 2014. So if you're interested in private or industrial timberland approach, Bob Reinierson from WM Beatty gave a great talk for that, as did Joe Sherlock, our regional silviculturist, who sort of framed out more like our operating guidelines and sort of larger national and regional direction. So you can find those online as well, pre-recorded. I'm really going to be discussing these dry cedar mixed conifer forests that have burned, particularly those that have burned with uncharacteristically large patches of high severity. And so these themes can be translated to other landscapes or ownerships, but that's the caveat, is just translate with caution. I'll be discussing this in terms of general considerations for project planners and implementers. There's a lot of variation out there, and when it comes to this, the devil truly is in the details. So no one can really cover this all at appropriate prescriptive detail in an hour talk. So I'll be really talking about big relevant themes. And I've been asked to talk about this at a number of different venues, so forgive me if there's a little duplication or you've seen one of these other talks. You may recognize some similar pictures, but I decided to start out with this picture. It sort of shows the dichotomy between maybe a private industrial timberland approach versus on the right, or I'm sorry, on the left versus sort of public lands with snags and brush on the right. And I've sort of taken this because people like to frame this, I think, in simple terms in shades of black and white, but it's really like this large, I think it can be a large palette or spectrum of gray. And so here we go. Oh, there we go. So primarily, the largest sort of challenges we're facing right now in the Sierra Nevada, I wanted to sort of throw this out in the context of some research that you can go and look at, and I've tried to cite that there. But this trend of increasing proportions of stand replacing high severity fire in the Sierra Nevada. And one of the biggest concerns is this increasing patch size of stand replacing fire, where we really are losing seed source out there, and we're finding a notable lack of natural regeneration, particularly in those pine species that are part of our desired conditions, and particularly in these large patch sizes. The other challenge that we face is just in these early seral stages, they're just inherently susceptible to high severity fire. So there's a time period there that your growing forest is susceptible to future disturbance. And there's some climate change trends that are suggesting, that we're going to see more active fire regimes. We're going to see maybe decreased suitability of natural regeneration. And so all of these are issues that our generation is going to have to deal with as land managers. So what makes this even more difficult is these forests that we manage and establish operate on much larger temporal scales than our careers or than our lifetimes. So we can use studies of past trends and processes to give us a great way of looking at forest regeneration. But some of these climate change trends, suggest that we might not be able to assume that those past trends are constant. So we need to sort of rethink what we're doing out there and what's it going to look like past what we're doing. So in that sense, it sort of behooves us to at least incorporate some planning for the unexpected, if you will. Okay, so this is the obligatory slide. These are the themes I intend to touch on. And so at the end of the talk, you can hold me to it. I want to talk a little bit about reforestation for restoration. I want to talk about this idea of managing risk and return and these post-fire landscapes as like an investment portfolio. I want to talk about large reforestation strategies and that one size does not fit all. How these landscapes are dynamic. Many of you guys probably have examples of that too. Heterogeneity is a large theme right now, particularly in green stands and silviculture, but I think these themes are pertinent to post-fire landscapes as well, because they've oftentimes, in these large, high-severity areas, we're going from one green homogeneous forest to one black homogeneous forest. And then I want to talk about, managing that investment over its lifetime and looking at competing vegetation. And then a brief sort of shout out to really the devil is in the details and just talk about what that devil may or may not look like. So the toughest challenge that I would say is these areas that have burned, like I said, at high severity, uncharacteristically large patches, and how do we transform that post-fire landscape into our vision of the desired condition? And that involves decisions of what to treat, what not to treat, and how we treat it. But at any rate, those should be rooted in really clear and measurable site-specific goals and objectives, a realistic acknowledgement of stand trajectories and potential for future disturbance. And it also needs to be balanced just by scale, timing, and our organizational capacity. Whether it's this year's capacity or our capacity to manage this landscape through the next few years that we're prescribing treatments. So one thing that I've really been wrestling with is, a lot of these dry mixed conifer forests, they would have had, when you look at a lot of the NRV assessments and the literature, they would have had this low frequent fire with maybe some mixed severity and some high severity at very much smaller patch sizes. And now we're seeing a patch size that is huge. And so I think it begs the question of how do we restore that patch size? Because if we do nothing, we're going to get a huge patch size of uncharacteristic or unnatural fuel loads out there, which will likely push those stand trajectories into maybe uncharted territory. And that may include, vegetation type conversion. Particularly, I think it presents really notable challenges in terms of, like I mentioned, fuel dynamics, future seed sources, and that potential fire behavior of reburns. So most of us all have, or we like to think that we're saving for the future, right? At least our future retirement. I think we can all relate to maybe that. And so I wanted to sort of maybe draw an analogy. It's a rough analogy, but I think when we come to managing these post-fire landscapes, we can approach it as we would managing our mutual fund portfolios. We balance risk and return. We try to invest in different investment tactics or strategies that balance that risk and return. We don't put all of our eggs into one basket. We're not all investing in stocks or bonds or and so I've sort of drawn up a very simplistic example here. I have 5 different slices of the pie, and I tried to, I could have put way more slices into this pie, but I couldn't get the pictures to come out so well. But you'll see, one is investing in some natural processes. Another is investing in a founder stand or a site prep for natural regen approach. Another is maybe investing in a low-density type of plantation. I have some high-density, conventional plantations. And then I intentionally have a gray slide there because I think, like I said earlier, these are a lot of shades of gray. And that sort of depends on what you might put into that portfolio. It depends on your site-specific objectives, restoration goals, and your environmental and socioeconomic factors that you need to consider in actually pulling it off. And that's from the implementation side. But the point here is there's no silver bullet, and there's no one right answer. But by maybe diversifying those investments, we build resilience into the overall portfolio or landscape. Now, we can argue over the proportional mix of those tactics, and I guess here that's where I'm offering that maybe the answer is based on you need to look at those goals and objectives. But I think it's really hard here to justify why we wouldn't consider using all the tools in the toolbox. Why we would deny somebody or a tactic a slice of that pie. So in an investment strategy for a retirement fund, it's pretty easy, right? Your objective is just growing your money over time, right? And you have one person that gets to dictate the interests, and their value system gets to dictate the risk and returns. So I'd like to make it a little bit more complex now. And instead of looking at it as a mutual fund portfolio, let's look at it as a trust administration, like an estate trust administration when somebody dies, right? So somebody dies and they bequeath their estate to a number of beneficiaries. And usually a trustee is designated to manage those assets of the estate for the benefits of those beneficiaries, right? But this is the tricky point. Now you just don't have one decision maker. You have multiple beneficiaries with multiple interests. Sometimes those interests could be competing interests, different value systems of balancing risk and return. And I think this is really similar to the Forest Service case, where the Forest Service is essentially the trustee for public lands. And so we manage the public lands for a diverse suite of interests and value systems that have different risk and returns. that are communicated to us by a diverse set of stakeholders. So you can see how the complexity can get larger and larger, especially when you're dealing with these large burned landscapes of public land. But I offer that, building some diversity in here is maybe the one general theme that we could look at as a solution. So as you're going to see here too, the landscape varies as well as our stakeholders. So, one size does not fit all. You can have spatial, proportional, and temporal variability of these fires. Now, we've long recognized the need for site specificity in land management plans, and the same applies to reforestation strategies. So here on this slide, we have 3 very different fires in terms of size, scale, and proportion of high severity. And I would expect that a post-fire restoration or reforestation strategy would consider this and the effects on vegetation, seed sources, et cetera, when developing that strategy. So the fire on the very left of the screen is a small fire, but has a relatively high proportion of high severity. The fire on the right-hand side is a very large fire, but you can see the proportion of severity is very different. And then in the middle of your screen, you see a large fire, actually 2 large fires that are adjacent to each other that have a very different proportion of severity. Of course, in here, forgive me, the green is lower severity, the red is higher severity, and the mixture in between. Now, I also threw in temporal variability here because I think it's especially important for land managers today. These fires don't give us the luxury of responding at our earliest convenience. In my experience, we had fires in 2006, 2007, and 2008, all in different areas in our district and our forest, all of different sizes and various factors, but the cumulative effect of these fires all required attention in the same management period, and that added another layer of complexity. We didn't get to just focus on one fire. We really had to develop that triage of working in multiple landscapes under the same time frame. And yet each individual fire restoration strategy may have varied had they not burned in consecutive years, and they varied according to their landscape. So again, I know most of you have seen this slide, but you've probably seen it very often in the past few years, but for good reason. And it really displays how the landscape variables affect heterogeneity of these forests. We've long recognized the need for this site specificity in silviculture prescriptions, and reforestation is in this category as well. In fact, we largely often do this by varying seed source, species mixes, et cetera. But I think we could also consider varying planting densities and arrangements using these themes as well. In addition, I think there can be site specificity in terms of uniqueness of place. For example, we may not reforest a California spotted owl pack, a recreation area, and an area for timber production all the same way. In some cases we may, in some cases we might not. So that just sort of depends on our land allocations that we have to plan for. And at the end, it boils down to those site-specific objectives and what your desired future condition is. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the dynamics of these post-fire landscapes. This is the biggest challenge. In the first decade or two, these landscapes are so dynamic, they're changing from year to year. These mid and late sterile forests were basically reduced to a landscape of snags within essentially a burning period. And that post-disturbance site colonization by your forbs, your grasses, your trees, your shrubs can be very dynamic too. Oftentimes this includes natural regeneration, and this can be a great resource if the species stocking and rates of growth sort of line up with your desired conditions. However, in some of these forests that are so far departed from their natural fire regimes, thanks to like a century of effective fire suppression, you may not get the natural regen that meets your objectives. Here's a case where the former was the case. We got some really nice natural regen in this stand. All those little arrows show some really nice conifer, largely pine regeneration. You can see we have some black oak regeneration as well. We were really happy with this thanks to a nearby seed source. And it met our objectives because it was in terrain that we couldn't really access very well. So we thought we would go with this. However, these landscapes are dynamic. And, there's the seed source there was sort of an island that was providing the seed source, which made this site so successful. But that's that landscape 12 years later when the Chips fire reburns the Storrie fire. We lost not only all of our natural regeneration that we were hoping would meet our desired future conditions, but that reburn had enough steam to really affect our seed source out there. So not only did we lose the natural regeneration, we lost the seed source. And so it's a good example of how in these dynamic environments, no one tactic is immune to any certain level of risk. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying not to invest in natural regeneration. I'm arguing that is an appropriate tactic in the diverse suite of investments in our portfolio, especially where you're getting that stocking and species to meet your desired condition. But the point here is that there's risks, and we probably don't want to put all of our eggs into that one basket banking on natural regeneration. I think this also drives home that the risk of reburn, even high severity reburn, is very real, if not increasingly real, given the projected trends in climate change and fire behavior and fire regimes. And I'd like to highlight some recent research that our ecology program has done in these fires. They've shown that the severity of these reburns are largely driven by fire weather, higher snag densities, and higher shrub cover. So these are things that we need to consider in managing in that post-fire landscape. The other thing I want to talk about here is safety. After working in these large post-fire landscapes, I really can't talk about reforestation without mentioning safety. You can see, on the left side of the screen, I have a tree that has shed all of its limbs, and then on the right side, there is another widow or widower maker or a hazard tree that can pose a hazard to public employees, public contractors, etc. And in working in these environments, you experience snag-fall dynamics firsthand, and it always has to be in the forefront of your mind. And we need to recognize that oftentimes trees don't fall in their entirety or all at once. They often shed bark, they shed limbs and tops over time that can pose a hazard to the people that are trying to do the work out there. And so that needs to be our first priority, is keeping those folks safe, both in the short term and in the long term, because a lot of these treatments require follow-up or maintenance treatments that need to be planned for. Now, there's two primary ways that we can do this. We can mitigate the exposure or our exposure to the hazards, or we can abate the hazards. And in effect, this is how you would manage your investments. So if you're going to try to plant without any salvage or site prep, you need to recognize that it may be unsafe later to perform any follow-up work. And with that comes a certain risk. So I really recommend front-loading safety into your reforestation strategy, and it needs to be constantly reevaluated as conditions change. So that snag fall, as I titled the last slide, you know, what grows up must come down. And this slide could be similarly titled, but for a different reason. Basically, as these snags deteriorate and fall to the forest floor, they contribute to the development of fuel profiles, which in the face of reburns could negatively affect the probabilities for long tree survival on that site. This is a site that we planted the spring immediately after the 2007 antelope fire. It wasn't included in any salvage plans, but it didn't have any surviving seed source. And it was your typical mid-seral closed canopy stand, you know, WHR, 4M, 4D. It's stand with an overstory pine component and a mid and understory component of largely shade-tolerant white fir, and it burned with high severity. We decided to just plant the stand. We knew the brush was coming, and we wanted to get a seed source out there, you know, a local seed source. Our seed source was from local seed stock, and we had some great survival because these trees were planted in the ground prior to shrub colonization. And this is a wide space cluster planting approach. You know, in retrospect, I wish we had the funding and the time to do the site prep, because we could have treated some of those smaller snags that are now contributing to the fuel loads. We have some really nice trees out there, but they are growing in an intermixed arrangement of jackstraw, fuels, shrubs, and a cheatgrass forb understory. And in the event of the fire, there is a risk that we may lose part of this investment. Now, in this case, the trees are getting to be big enough. We were able to get the trees in the ground soon enough that they're actually getting to be big enough that we could probably get in here with mechanical equipment and do some follow-up fuels treatment. But we really aren't going to be able to do a lot of handwork in here because of those overhead hazards, at least at this point in time. So it underscores that, you know, much like that Storrie fire example, our artificial regeneration can be vulnerable to reburn as well if we're not taking the measures to treat some of the snags and shrubs. And again, this can be a part of your portfolio, but it shouldn't be your entire portfolio. I have another picture here that I wanted to really emphasize that timing is so important. This is another stand that we planted, but 3 years after the fire. Now, you know, believe me now or believe me later, but there are actually trees out there under that, that shrub cover. And so we do have a success in establishing those trees, but again, those trees are in a highly competitive environment right now, and will have some fuels issues to deal with in the next decade. And this is an example where we likely couldn't put mechanical equipment in there without risking some of that investment, because we just can't see those trees to work around them at this point. So in terms of that, I wanted to talk about what site prep does look like and how it can be used as an ecologically appropriate tool in restoring long-term fuel profiles and enhancing resistance to reburn. This is an example after the 2012 Chips fire. We really, in these areas, we identified that we wanted to do some site prep to manage these fuel profiles over time. that site prep, you can see the line in the foreground. Everything below that line or in the immediate foreground, those trees have been felled but not piled. In the background, you can see that hill slope where the trees have been felled but piled. And so you can see how we've really broken up the continuity of and homogeneity of what that fuel profile would look like. Now you'll also notice though that we left some trees out there, and I think it's relevant to talk about, these landscapes may not have future snag and large woody debris recruitment for decades to come. So part of that strategy was to retain ecologically appropriate levels of snags and woody debris out there to serve those purposes. This was a plantation or a mixed plantation that wasn't salvaged. But safety-wise, you can see that while we didn't eliminate all the overhead hazards, we did provide for escape routes and safety zones, and the hazard out there is much more reduced to people who are going to be doing that follow-up work out in the woods. Here's another example. This is a post-salvage example where this unit was salvage logged. All of the submersional material was left from the salvage sale, and we collected some KV funds to do some site prep. I want you to note the red arrow is showing sort of a fork top green tree that we retained out there. This is what some of the fuel loads looked like. These are the more heavier accumulations, but some of those accumulations after the salvage. And so we prescribed site prep, and you can see the difference in terms of fuel profiles. We piled that, and those piles were burned, and this site was planted the following spring. And again, site prep does not need to be black or white. There's a lot of shades. You can write prescriptions that retain a certain level of snags, a certain level of large down woody debris to meet our soil cover and our habitat needs. But we are managing that fuel profile over time. So when we get these trees established in the future of a reburn, they won't be burning in an uncharacteristically high fuel load. I also wanted to talk a little bit about planting windows. The next step after site prep is planting. And I think we really need these. We really need to look at planting windows like burn windows because timing is imperative. I think many people relate to the idea of burn windows for prescribed fire program, and I know the reforestation specialist relates to this, but I don't think the general public really understands that planting is very timing specific, whether or not, both seasonally, whether you're planting in the spring or the fall, but also over the years in terms of time since disturbance. Because once that site has been disturbed, plants are starting to colonize and dominate that site almost immediately after the disturbance. In terms of ideal planting conditions, we'd ideally, for spring planting, we'd ideally like to be there the day the snow melts off the unit. We want the soils at field capacity. We want soil temperatures 40 degrees and rising, and that maximizes our success for establishing tree seedlings. So I'm saying timing here, but I'm also implying some scale to it, because if you have a really dry year like this year, you might only have a planting window of 3 weeks on your site, whereas if you have a really wet year, you may have a much larger planting window. And this sort of affects the scale at which we take bites out each year to plant. When you're trying to plant 10,000 acres in a year, and you only have a month to do it, that's a really tall order. So, you really, when you're designing a plan, you need to figure out what your organizational capacity and what your ecological window is going to be to get those trees in the ground when you need to get them into the ground to maximize your success. And managing scale more effectively can help you manage the timing. And that way you're not stuck with trees that you're trying to get in the ground when the ground's not really conducive to it. So I want to go back here, one last thing about the timing. What folks sometimes don't realize is that it also takes us time to grow a seedling in the nursery for outplanting. We can't go out to or we don't want to go out to just some random nursery and buy, a tree to put in the ground. There's a lot of science behind this, a lot of details, a lot of site-specific, local seed collection. In Region 5, we're really fortunate to have a nursery that helps us with this. But once you have a fire that burns in the summer, the following October, we put in a sowing order, and it takes a year to grow that seedling out. And so that needs to be factored into your strategy. And once you've got that tree grown, you have to plant it. You can hold it over sometimes, but once we pull the trees out of the nursery and put them in the freezer or in our coolers, they need to get into the ground within about a month or so. Okay. We've heard a lot about heterogeneity and in heterogeneity in desired conditions, and how heterogeneity and themes of heterogeneity can enhance resistance and resilience to disturbance. And we've heard a lot about this in green forests, but I think some of the same themes are pertinent to post-fire environments, particularly those large patches of high severity where homogeneity is likely an issue. And so there are multiple planting arrangements and cultural treatment pathways that we can use to get there. It just depends on our objectives, our timing, and our funding. So on the left is a great picture from Jamie Leiderson's paper, Jamie Leiderson et al. I have the citation up there, showing a good example of a heterogeneous arrangement that we might be shooting for in a mid to late sterile desired condition. The tough part with reforestation is you need to start out, how do you get from point A to point, Z, if you will. And so on the middle and on the right, I have two very general versions of how planting arrangements and follow-up, PCT or pre-commercial thinning or mortality could be designed to promote heterogeneity. In the middle is your more conventional square space planting arrangement. Trees can be planted at 10 by 10, 12 by 12, 16 by 16, heck, even 20 by 20 grids. It just depends on the density that you're interested in. And in this case, they're planted in a square grid. On the right is a wide space cluster arrangement wherein clusters of 3 trees that are planted, 5 to 10 feet apart, with those clusters planted somewhere between 25 and 30 feet apart. And it creates basically different tree neighborhoods, if you will. I really need to recognize Dwayne Nelson and Mike Landrum for the cluster planting idea. They're the ones I think that really introduced it. This could be modified as well. I've seen people do 5 trees per cluster and different spacings per cluster as well. It just depends on, again, the density that you're trying to achieve on your site. And Joe Sherlock did this great diagram where he shows, the pathways where a conventional square space planting may develop heterogeneity with pre-commercial thinning or mortality over time. And so there's what that might look like. And in the wide space cluster planting, similarly, either through PCT or variable mortality, one tree may be eliminated from this cluster, 2 trees may be eliminated from this cluster, and 3 trees may be eliminated from this cluster. That's going to give you a more heterogeneous pattern on the landscape that hopefully, may mimic maybe the aesthetics of a more natural forest, or provide for some growing space, additional growing space for natural regeneration if you're lucky to get, the right species and stocking rates. So you really have to sort of think about your objectives and what kind of neighborhood or tree neighborhood you want to promote. What you're trying to achieve and through what kind of trajectories or silvicultural manipulations and how soon. Here again, I really have to thank Joe Sherlock. He did a great diagram of what the difference in tree neighborhood may look like between a square space plantation and a cluster plantation. So with a sort of grid planting, you'll have to rely on natural regen if you want to have a tree established closer than your desired spacing. With the idea of the cluster planting, the idea is that you're sort of front-loading that into the design. So you're having clusters of trees, but you're spacing them far enough apart such that those 3 trees still have a lot of growing space and resources to grow. And the idea behind that is you may be managing your need for pre-commercial thinning or, like I said, allowing for some additional growing space for natural regen. I think both arrangements need to be considered and implemented as your objectives guide. And these are only 2 arrangements. I've seen hexagonal spacing, rectangular spacing, cluster planting with 5 to 7 trees. This is the really cool, interesting, creative part of silviculture is there's room for creativity here, and it should be guided by your objectives and your site-specific factors. And again, like I said, it just depends on that neighborhood that you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, through which means, through what funding sources. And so I want you to keep in mind, too, that arrangement is just that. It's just the way we plant the trees. There are other variable factors variables that factor into this, like density, which can also be adjusted per your objectives and stand trajectories. So here's an example of a square space 10 by 10 foot spacing. We take a tour every year or a monitoring trip to sort of what I like to call the good, the bad, the ugly. And I'd say this is good. This is a 10 by 10 foot spacing plantation. It's your high density plantation. It's probably coming online for PCT here if we wanted to promote some heterogeneity. We've got some good success, and this is a totally legitimate tactic within the portfolio, particularly with our multiple use sustained yields mandate and NFMA mandates from Congress. So many of you probably have examples of this on your forest, so I won't show you a ton of pictures of plantations. But I will show you another example of cluster planting. This is a cluster planting that we did on the Boulder Fire in 2006. It was burned in 2006. We were able to actually harvest it in the winter of 2007, and then we planted it with wide-spaced cluster planting in spring of 2007. So here you're seeing some clump creation with legacy structure of retention at variable scales, some down woody debris, some snags, and you're seeing that sort of heterogeneous establishment of of trees that maybe mimic a more natural stand. This is in a recreation area, so this was sort of guided by those objectives. And it also had some bald eagle habitat, and we were also considering future timber opportunities. Here's another photo. You can see, maybe I'll try the pointer here. You can see some of these clusters of 3 that survived, and a single tree, and an area where we didn't get some survival, but then areas where we got great survival. And you can see different species: Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, ponderosa pine. I think there's some incense cedar and some Doug fir in the mix. So you can sort of see that that variability or that heterogeneity that comes in. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit. The last thing I really wanted to talk about was this need to manage for our long-term performance of this investment. And we talked earlier about site prep, primarily in the context of managing fuel profiles, but I also wanted to talk about site prep in terms of targeting shrubs to create suitable sites for planting trees. I affectionately call Mike Landrum the Paul Revere of shrubs. He came out and said, the shrubs are coming, you got to get the trees in the ground. And I understand why he was so concerned. And I think this picture, I took this picture with, in the middle here is one of our 1-year-old, Styroton D planting stock with, the root ball here, the root wad. Here is, I think that's greenleaf Manzanita Arctostapha spatula. You can see that root extends further down off of that planting box. This is, I think this is an Intergeremis ceanothus species, the root far much longer. Pine mat Manzanita, very small top but very long root. And another example, I think of maybe Intergeremis there, that the root actually extends outside of the picture. So you can see the competitive environment that these trees that we put in the ground are in. And competition these first few years are largely for soil moisture in the A and B horizons of that site. And shrubs are so ecologically well-adapted competitors. They quickly colonize the site, they resprout, they can dominate these post-disturbance sites, and they have enormous capacity for root growth and are our primary competitors for available soil moisture. So in this regard, it's really a race against time, and you can see why, because it takes us a year and some change to order and produce a 1-year stock for outplanting in the field. This is a picture of some trees that, they've survived, but we haven't managed that competing vegetation. And you can see that they are competing heavily with those shrubs, not only for water, but also for light at this point. And that has very real effects on tree growth, and it maintains those trees in a very vulnerable stage to reburn. And I should note, whether that be natural regeneration or artificial regeneration. Here is some manual release we've done, and the whole purpose behind this is to improve the competitive environment on a microsite for those trees. So those trees can grow above the brush and at least take hold for both survival, but also for growth. And fiddler, okay, so I'm not a huge Rolling Stones fan, but while time may be on Mick Jagger and Keith Richards' side, I think it is. I don't think that this is necessarily on the side of reforestation, particularly given some of these trends with climate change and reburn. And McDonald and Fiddler have a great figure and some great research comparing height growth of trees in various levels of shrub competition. And you can see here that over the 25-year period, there was a 15-foot difference in height between a 7 to 8 foot tall tree that was competing in heavy brush versus almost a 25-foot tall tree that had no shrub competition. And so the real question here, or what's really interesting to me, is the implications for reburn. So you really have to be asking yourself, what's the probability that this plantation is going to burn in 25 years? Because maybe we're not setting up this 5-year-old tree, or this 25-year-old but 7 to 8 foot tall tree for survival. And I have some pretty direct first-hand experience with this. Here's a picture of a 20 to 30 foot tall tree in one of our plantations that simply was not of sufficient size and height to be able to tolerate or survive the reburn. So I think this emphasizes why we need to consider managing shrub communities for tree growth. And again, this doesn't have to be all or nothing. This can be a mosaic of shrubs on the site. In some levels do fix nitrogen and provide for habitat. Again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing like we typically frame the debate. I think this is another creative place for silviculture to go in how do we balance both shrub communities and maximize tree growth to get them out of these vulnerable stages. So here's an example of, this is actually my son. Some pictures say thousands of words, and these pictures are a little personal to me, but I thought I'd share them with you because I think part of being a land manager is developing an intimate relationship with the landscape over time. And while our careers encompass a short span of a forest lifetime, we can affect positive change. And so here's a 3-year-old versus a 4-year-old tree. And here's a 40-year-old versus the same now 7-year-old tree, or trees. And you can see those two trees, and we're probably looking at I'm 6 feet tall, so that's probably, 7 to 10 feet tall within 7 years. That's some really great rate of growth. And what excites me about this is not only having tall trees, but the sooner that we can grow these trees out of those vulnerable stages, the sooner we can introduce processes like fire back into these post-fire environments without adversely affecting our regeneration investment. I intend to come back to this site. So I better wrap up here. And so this is my last pitch, is that the devil's in the details. And, we talked about how these environments are dynamic, how timing is everything, that sort of post-disturbance land rush for growing space, the need to manage your scale appropriately with your objectives and your funding, your capacity, and details. I think a lot of people look at reforestation as a simple process, and it really is way more complex than I think a lot of folks give it. So this is my ending thought. You've heard me talk a lot about managing for diverse interests and balancing those interests and risks and returns. I think that's the legacy that we leave to our next generation of resource managers who are going to be managing our plantations. And here I think whether we've talked all this time about post-fire landscapes, I think the same strategy is relevant to pre-fire green landscapes that are actually maybe more restorable in a sense. And, when we get to these post-fire landscapes, we're looking at at triage and putting we're looking at triage and trying to do the best we can with a far departed landscape. I think it emphasizes, and don't get me wrong, I think we need to focus on these landscapes, but we also need to focus or maintain our focus on the green landscapes as well before they burn. So with that, I better wrap up, and I'd like to thank you for your time and participation today. I'd like to thank a lot of folks who graciously shared photos, feedbacks, and a lot of lively discussion. And I'd also like to, thank our Plumas reforestation team. What I've shown you today is really the good result of a large team of people that are focused on this issue, and that regional silviculture and nursery support that we get that I think needs to be acknowledged. So with that, I will turn it over. Thanks again.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. I know I learned a ton in that presentation. Really great job. I loved all the analogies going through, and I think if anyone is starting out in your position, you should send them this link. It was very informative. So with that, we're going to go ahead, and I know we're about out of time here, but we're still have a few minutes, and we'll just do some questions and answers. I do want to point out at the bottom of your screen, there's a link to the webinar evaluation survey. If you would it probably takes less than 10 minutes to fill this out for us. It helps us know what future webinars, how we can organize them, and also lets us report back to the people who fund us about the job that we're doing. There's also the list for the email sign-up, so that's a newsletter that comes out once a month from the California Fire Science Consortium, and it has links to upcoming webinars, field trips, events, and new products. After this presentation, probably sometime later today, if you registered, I will send you a link that has a recording of this presentation, as well as any of the articles that he discussed. I can put up a link to that and to the PowerPoint slides. So with that, let's take a few minutes for questions here. So the first one is from Carlos, and he wants to know, how extensively have you used cluster planting on the Plumas?
Oh, hi Carlos. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we've done a lot of cluster planting. I think I know folks on the MODOC have. Kathy Carlock has on the MODOC. I've seen her do like 5 trees per cluster. I think those on the Blue Fire. We've done quite a bit of cluster planting mixed in with conventional square space planting as well. But we've got quite a few thousand acres that we've done. Like I said, varies with site prep and manual release, but we've done it on a few different fires, so we have some examples. I showed just the Boulder Fire because that's sort of my oldest, or the first crack that we had at it, and is the most developed, and I thought that might be interesting to folks to see. That was in 2007, so it's been about 8 years now.
Okay. Our next question is coming from Dan, and he wants to know if you have any good resources for restoration planting in redwoods or coastal forests.
Okay, hi Dan. I'm so smiling. It's nice to see you up there. Shoot, I have to be honest with you. That's not my that's not my region, sort of. I don't deal with redwood and coastal forests. Again, though, I would sort of look, I know the private foresters in the Coast Range are doing probably the most right now. And shoot, I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. Let me think about that, and I know how to catch you via email to follow up.
And Dan, I'll also look into that and see if we have any resources on our website about that, or we can get you in touch with someone who might. Let's see, our next question here is, any thoughts on dealing with the dead or downstanding wood for better regeneration? Yeah,
well, okay, thanks. That's a great question. That's why we're definitely trying to make more of the investment in site prep where our funding allows and where we can retain receipts, that kind of thing, through KV. And this, again, I have been reading a lot of, I think Brandon Collins has a really cool paper on sort of patch sizes of severity in different forest types. And I've been sort of thinking about this with relationship to those dry, pine-dominated mixed conifer forests. You know, if under their natural fire regime, they would naturally have a much smaller patch size of high severity. Maybe, you know, I'm just going to use very general examples, but more, you know, on the, you know, 2-5 acre max kind of scale versus the, you know, 100, 200, 300 acre max. Really, if we're interested in restoring those forests, we shouldn't be leaving hundreds of acres of snags out there, because that's going to create a reburn fire regime that's far outside of the fire regime that a pine forest would have established in. But again, I think there can be some room for creativity and some variability of different patch sizes. You can have some acres with no large down woody debris, but you'll have to retain structures and sizes of others. I know in our site prep, though, we are targeting those smaller activity fuel, sort of those trees that grew up in fire suppression. So really, those are the trees that we're targeting for removal or treatment. The trees that we're really targeting for retaining on those sites are our nice large down woody debris, or our nice large snags that really would have existed before the fire regime got so out of whack.
All right, we have one last question and then we'll wrap it up here. This is coming from Cody. He asks, there's obviously a lot of variability, but can you talk in general terms about target stand density? And the second part of that question is, what is the currently prevailing thinking about stand density and fire vulnerability? Okay.
Well, Cody, I'm afraid I don't feel like it's appropriate for me to give you a number. But I have been sort of thinking in terms of, you know, if you look at relative density, there's sort of the conventional paradigm that, you know, you manage between 40% and 60% relative density. But in some of these, like, reference condition stands, I think if you looked at relative density, you'll find that a lot of those stands were maintained at very low relative densities, basically by disturbance, basically fire. And I know on the east side of our forest, you know, we have really large pines, but I don't think those pines got large merely from time. Those pines got large because they were maintained in very open growing spaces. And I'm sort of going to tie on to Pat Trimble's question here and the experience with hand grubbing versus herbicides, because I think this is pertinent to Cody's question too, is if your goal is to grow late seral forests, and maybe late seral forests rather quickly, we need to maintain these trees at densities, and we need to maintain the shrub competition at densities where these trees can have maximum growing space. And that means that all tools need to be on the table, including hand grubbing and herbicides. And that also means, getting back to your question, Cody, that all densities need to be on the table, of, you know, planting some sites denser, like maybe down in the drainage, using some of the GTR concepts, and planting ridge tops maybe at lesser densities. That's the kind of thing that I think gets me up in the morning, is those, that, like I said, that window of creativity that silviculturists really have here.
All right, and with that, I know we're a little bit over time, but we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great presentation, and thanks so much for your expertise.